Hello and welcome to the next lecture, the Yoruba and the Fon. Although we're mostly going to be talking about Yoruba in this particular one. So Yoruba land is what is the area that modern Yoruba live. You can see from here that that it's in a couple of different places. It's the most populous language group in West Africa. It's the most common ancestry of African Americans, and this data comes from DNA tests that Black people in America have done. Actually, many groups trace ancestry to the ancient city that we're going to talk about, Ile-Ife. Amongst the Yoruba, the Orisha are gods, and the way that these gods function, it's kind of an animistic type of religion. So some are spirits that are located in animals and nature, but also some that are sort of independent in a way. But these gods are continually created. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of gods, or Orisha. So Ori means head, and Ashe means life force. So you put those two together, and you get Orisha. And they have been a highly urban people since very ancient times, as we will see in just a moment. So the origin of Ife is Ile-Ife, is the navel of the world. So the origin story is Oduduwa and Obitala came down from heaven to create earth and people. And in this story, the earth was all water, so a pretty typical primordial type of world in a creation story. Oduduwa pours sand in the water and sends a chicken down to spread the earth. The chickens were sent to Ife, and Oduduwa becomes the first Oni, which is the king amongst the people of Ife. So this story might not seem so auspicious if you're used to other types of creation stories, but it makes sense. When you think about it, what do chickens do? And normally, if I'm teaching this class in person, I kind of mime it, but you can do it yourself. Think about how chickens are always kind of like scraping their feet backwards. So it makes sense that they would be the ones that are sent down. And the type of story where we have a sort of creator type of God, somewhat a creator God, it's common to have that creator or other type of God to be a king amongst the people. So kind of like a culture hero type of person. So Ile-Ife is the Yoruba capital. It's the most important art center in Nigeria from about 1200 until 1400. That's known as the pavement era. And Ife is a pretty big and organized city from about 800 until 1500. So during the pavement era, it tells you that there was an urban agglomeration before that, because the pavement era basically represents a ceremonial center that was created from the ground up. So there was already an urban area that was pretty built up before that, and then they built the ceremonial center in the middle of it. So this is a drawing showing some of the patterns that they had. They call it the pavement era because they have these brick and stone kind of pavements and different patterns. So here is just an idea, a reproduction of what this particular area may have looked like at the time. We're going to look at some of these bronze heads, but it's not absolutely certain if they were used in this way, and they weren't necessarily found archaeologically in this way. So this is just a way to visualize what it could have looked like when Ife was occupied. So these particular bronze heads that we're going to look at, including this one, were buried in sacred groves and first growth forests, and these sacred groves are still kept today and passed on to people that didn't necessarily have a direct connection with the people of Ife. These bronze heads were rediscovered by Africans in the 1600s, and by that point, as we had talked about before, the Portuguese and other Europeans had already been there and had been slave trading. So people knew that there was a great danger from Europeans. So they reburied them to protect them from European missionaries who were using Catholicism as part of the imperial plan of Europeans. So in 1900, some of the locals showed the groves to a German collector, and from there it was on. A lot of the pieces that I'm showing you are ones that were from pretty standard archaeological digs, so ones that were done in a scientific way. But some of them were also acquired just by people going into the groves and just picking them up. And that's an issue that we will see throughout Africa, that pieces, you don't have the same sort of archaeology that you would have in other places. And part of that grows out of imperialism and neo-imperialism. Europeans and Asians as well will see Africa as the origin of human beings, certainly, but not necessarily a site where you would be doing this type of archaeology, digging up complex urban centers and art like we're looking at here. So as a result, and also because of other things that we'll talk about, especially when we get to modern West Africa, you don't get funding for properly scientific digs. And then on top of that, there oftentimes isn't Africans who are actually doing the work. So think about that when we're looking at pieces like this. So as far as what the piece means itself, I mean, obviously what we're seeing is a certain amount of idealism. This person's, the first thing you probably thought is this is a beautiful man. And so there's a bit of idealism going on, a perfectly symmetrical face, and very nice proportions between the different facial qualities. As far as the lines, it could represent scarification patterns. So modern Yoruba, although contemporary Yoruba don't necessarily do it so much, but modern Yoruba, mostly confined to old people, do scarification on their face. And it's related to the various secret societies that they're in, men's societies, women's societies, and Gelede, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So it could be a continuation with those types of scarifications. And the Yoruba that still do the scarifications, and again, it's kind of disappearing. They do a different kind than we talked about before, the colloid ones. Instead, they're cutting with something super sharp, like a razor, patterns into the face, and then they let it heal up, and you have these very thin and narrow lines. And a lot of the scarification patterns function showing the status of the person in a particular secret society, and the patterns themselves may have a certain amount of power, power that only the person who gets scarification patterns can possess. So it would make sense for the Oni here, the king, perhaps to have scarification patterns. It could be also that the people at this time thought that this was aesthetically pleasing, to put these types of shapes. It emphasizes the facial features, the symmetry, everything you would expect. So obviously it's a very naturalistic piece, but idealistic. Again, the person who this is a portrait of probably wasn't this beautiful, perhaps close. But we're going to kind of notice this, and we've already noticed it throughout the class. Many times cultures start with naturalism, because even though that's technically difficult, in some ways it's conceptually the most simple. But then as societies move through time, they tend to move to abstraction, which is a little bit more complex as far as content, and being able to understand the symbols of various modifications of form. So the type of idealism we see are ones that we've seen in other West African cultures. So there's a large forehead, which is thought to be beautiful, and hair is done in such a way to emphasize that. But also it shows wisdom. And this is one of these qualities that maybe it's possible a universal. Humans all around the world have asked and been shown pictures of people with large foreheads, and they generally see them as smart or wise or whatnot. The calm and serene look is something that you would expect from a leader. Well, in West Africa, they would expect from a leader. So a leader isn't supposed to be affected emotionally by events. They're supposed to be someone that's be able to be calmly make decisions. So it's the same thing with the mouth closed. I'm not going to talk about modern Yoruba kings, but there's a couple of elements that are related to modern Yoruba kings that may be why we see mouths closed. So modern Yoruba kings, they are expected to wear a kind of beaded crown that covers their face. And that's because they are considered to be kind of godlike kings, and their voice could be damaging to regular people. So it's kind of a filter for people. So that may be part of the reason why the mouth is closed. You have to speak carefully because your voice and your words are powerful. But also, just in general, you want to see leaders. Well, in West Africa, they want to see leaders that are weighing options, and when they speak, they thought about it, and they come up with something very concise that people can follow. So all of these qualities are both beautiful, but also they express character that's expected of kings. So the first one we were looking at was the Oriade, which means the outer head. And these words are coming from modern Yoruba. So as far as the application to Ile Ife, it may be a little bit difficult, but modern Yoruba kind of relate these ideas to these particular sculptures. So the Oriade is the actual physical self that's seen by others, obviously idealistic in the one that we saw, but that's the outside. And then the Ori Inu, which is in some ways more important, is the inner head. And that is something that is spiritual and invisible. So if you think of Mulade and you think of the female griot character, one of the other characters asked her why the men take away our radios. And one of the characters said they're trying to lock up their minds. And the female griot said, how can you lock up something that is invisible? So a concept that we see in a lot of cultures in West Africa. And the idea with the Ori Inu is it embodies fate and true being. So your future and what you actually are. So something that you could do in the extra credit board is take a look at this and think, how does the form relate to these ideas? Can you get a relationship between the form and these ideas? So if you're looking for something on the extra credit board, post something there and give your ideas on what qualities of this particular figure may show some of these ideas of the spiritual, invisible, and fate and true being. So what are these pieces used for? In the reproduction I showed you earlier, that was one idea. It was in shrines, and it's possible that it was used in that way and also in reburials. So amongst the modern Yoruba, after a king dies, the king is buried secretly until a successor is picked. So the idea is when a king dies, even though sometimes people will be expecting it, you want to keep everything very stable. So the advisors of the king will get together, kind of like the cardinals to pick a pope, and they'll decide on a successor. Oftentimes, this has already been decided beforehand, but it's just to make sure that everybody is happy with what's going on. Remember kingship in West Africa when he talked about it in the Ashanti. Kings aren't necessarily thought to be the ones that are the main focus of the power or the person that wields the power. Instead, the king kind of wields the power for the people. So it's really important that everybody agrees on the successor and also to keep stability so there isn't some kind of struggle for power amongst others. So then after a successor is picked and all their ducks are in a line, there is a second burial. Obviously, they don't want to dig up the body of the dead king. So instead, they will make a wooden kind of mannequin and then attach a three-dimensional likeness of the king to the mannequin. So if you take a look at this piece, there's some holes on the bottom, which may suggest that it was connected to another figure Could be a wooden mannequin, could be something else. There's also holes in the head if you look very carefully. And this is could have been to attach hair, but I think it's more likely that it was used to attach a crown. Modern Yoruba kings, I told you about a crown that covers their face and their head. There's a really good example at the DIA if we can ever go again. So over the years, there are also pieces that were found of women, similarly idealistic with these kind of like perfect proportions and symmetry, same type of calm face, high forehead, again, showing kind of like wisdom and speaking carefully. So women, it's been speculated based on this, that women may have been singular monarchs. So you might have an oba, but then you would also have an oba that could be a woman. This figure is obviously clay, terracotta, perhaps part of a complete figure made out of another material, or perhaps made out of the same material and had been destroyed or whatnot. We don't know exactly. This piece, there's traces of paint, so it was once painted with bright colors. So here's from the side. Again, like quite a bit of idealization. If you went back to see this woman, she may not have been as perfectly symmetrical or had exactly these features. But again, like we saw with the previous ones with the Oni, very idealized. So we can see it here as well. So this one is showing a standing Oni, and it's not supposed to represent that the Oni was a little person. Instead, just like with a high forehead, the large head shows wisdom and intelligence. So there's a bit of change in the proportions to show what's important to have in a king. And the king is also carrying various regalia that works as iconography to show elements of his power. So moving on to the modern Yoruba, we're going to talk about an area ibeji figures. And this comes from what happens amongst the Yoruba. They have the highest twinning rate of any culture in the world. So when a twin dies, whether it's in stillborn or in life, these figures are commissioned, and the figure is cared for like human beings by either the mother, if it's during infancy, or the surviving twin. So when a twin dies, they're procured by Babalawo, which is a type of priest who commissions an artist to be able to make this piece. The artist that makes it doesn't necessarily know the person it's being made for. There's this idea of keeping kind of a separation between the commissioner and the artist themselves. So after a mother and a twin die, the figures are kept in a shrine, as you can see on the right one. And that's what you should be thinking about when you see these in a museum, including the DIA, is that these figures were meant to be kept in a shrine by the community forever. So when you see pieces in a museum, they were almost certainly stolen from a shrine like this. So think about that when you're looking at these and how African art is valued because of these types of facts. So the pieces, after they're made, kind of like what we saw with the akuba, they're rubbed, clothed, fed, given beads, like you can see in this one. They have hairstyles that represent hairstyles that Yoruba people used to have, especially women. And so these very complex hairstyles are no longer around. Again, when we talk about modern contemporary art, we'll talk about how imperialism and neo-imperialism has affected what men and women can do. As a result, you don't see these types of hairstyles anymore. So the beads symbolize living twins' association with the Orisha, and twins are thought to have a particular association with Shango, the thunder god. Twins are known as the children of thunder. So a historical king, the fourth of the Oyo Empire, was forced to commit suicide by his underlings and by his court. And this was thought to be kind of like the wrong thing and angered gods. So Shango became angry, created thunderstorms that destroyed crops. So since twins have an association with Shango, it's thought that it's particularly necessary that when a twin dies to placate Shango so he doesn't send another series of thunderstorms and destroy the life that people have. So the ones that you see in this lecture, and if you're going to see some in a museum, are carved out of wood. And like the hairstyles, one of the things that imperialism, neo-imperialism has destroyed is some of these woodworking traditions where people have to struggle doing other sorts of work, and we don't see these types of pieces being made anymore. But people still follow the practice. So modern archaeology could be plastic dolls, photographs, anything that you can get, and you take care of it just like a regular ibeji. So you can see here a woman, she has one twin, and then the archaeology in the front. So these dolls are from England. They're just industrial produced, and they're using these particular dolls to represent the archaeology. So it kind of makes sense when you think about this figure, since the Yoruba have the highest twinning rate in the world, there are twins tend to die, especially in childbirth, but even once they've been born in life, earlier than people that are born singly for many different reasons. So it would make sense that a culture would come up with a practice to be able to deal with the pain and suffering that this causes. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this section is the Gelede. And I used to have some pretty great videos of the Gelede, one that showed some translations into English. Nowadays, it's kind of like a theater show, but those videos are no longer available. If they do become available again, hopefully I can get a link to them. So the Gelede society consists of women and men, but it's always led by a woman. So the entire purpose of the Gelede masquerade is an offering to our mothers. So Iyanla, these are female deities, ancestors, and elderly living women. And the king must draw on their power to rule. So remember, power is ashe, life force. So when you look at some of these masks when they're representing women, sometimes we'll see that there's some whiskers down here, and that's supposed to represent postmenopausal women who sometimes will get facial hair and other qualities. So postmenopausal women are considered to have, first off, the wisdom of being older, the association with our mothers, but also they have kind of like both the power of both genders. So that's why living elderly women are considered to be particularly valuable. So the idea with this is that you do the Gelede for the Iyanla, and the king can continue to rule. But it also functions in a way as a way to teach people how to behave, to make fun of people, do some parodies or whatnot, and to bring the community together. So a lot of times these will be kind of like shows. So Gelede maskers entertain and enlighten the community and our mothers, pleasing, placating, and thus encouraging them to use their extraordinary powers for the well-being of society. Gelede performers are thus a sacrifice, Ibo, an appeal to the forces in the world using the ecstatic power of mass, costume, music, song, and dance to evoke and comment upon social and spiritual matters, helping to shape society and those within it in constructive ways. So all of the dancers, even ones that are playing female characters, are men. And every West African culture that does masquerades, that is the case, except for the Sowe mask that we saw earlier. So you notice in this picture from a modern one, when we were looking at the earlier ones, all of the paint has worn off. But they were once brightly painted. And when these are done nowadays, people use industrial paint. and fabrics, the brightest they can get. Some of these fabrics are embroidered with power imagery and power words in a way. And you can see the brightest paints possible. And these are both feminine characters, but they're danced by men. So colorful costumes and masks with modern paints and printed fabrics. But you also notice that while the ceremony is going on, the crowd is somewhat continuous with the dancers. So some of these function kind of like plays, and when the characters are doing their thing, when they're doing the part of the story, again, which will be, a parody or moral lessons or something like that, people in the audience will interact with them. They'll talk to the characters who are acting wrongly and make fun of them or challenge them or whatnot. So this is expected to be a participatory art form, not just the dancers, but the people in the audience as well. And sometimes they'll do things in modern times to kind of show how things are changing and to kind of like parody and control these types of changes. So one example would be, and I talked about a little bit in detail in the text, is they have a couple of masks that look like white people and a white couple, specifically a man and a woman. And they are shown acting as white people do when they take visits to Africa. They often see it as white people often see it as this exotic kind of like romantic trip where they can have this beautiful background to service their relationship. So they'll show the white people in the mass, and they'll have little books and be writing notes in it, because you know how they love to. European and American white travelers love to have little books where they can write elements of their story. And then they'll show them kind of like going off to the side a little bit, and they'll mime them having sex to show that Europeans, they don't know the social rules and they can be somewhat crude in these types of trips. So it's a way to parody white people, show this kind of like outsider othering through exoticism that Europeans and white Americans tend to do when they visit Africa.